Welcome to WriterSpeak, dedicated to the written word and those who produce it. In our studio today is Dr. Ruth Schwartz, and she has written quite an amazing guidebook titled Soul on Earth, a guide to living and loving your human life. Welcome, Ruth.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, this has been quite an interesting book to look at. There's so many questions I would like to ask you. Could you tell me a little bit about your background?
As I talk about in the book's introduction, I was a kid that was, from the very beginning, as far back as I can remember, I was always wondering about the big questions in life. What am I here for? What are any of us here for? What is this human life about? Why is there so much pain and suffering in humanity? And so those questions always drove me. And initially in my professional life, they drove me to become a poet. I think poets are kind of the professionals in our society that get to grapple with those big questions often, maybe the poets and the priests. And I also became a health educator and worked with people around AIDS and sexuality. Then I became a college professor and taught creative writing. And then I stumbled upon a wisdom tradition that really opened my eyes to a lot of the powerful tools. We can call them spiritual tools, we can call them consciousness tools, that helped me not answer the questions I'd been asking all that time, but sort of engage with them more deeply and more satisfyingly and reach a place of greater peace within myself. And then out of that, I developed a lot of tools to help other people reach that same level of peace.
It would be nice to hear about that you have a private practice. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I work with people both one-on-one, and I work with couples. I also teach people in small groups. I lead workshops. Lots of different ways, in addition to the written word with all of its power, to try to get the message across to people and try to help people to use the tools that have been so transformational in my own life.
And what is your primary focus when you work with people?
Well, the place where I start is always helping people connect with an inner resource, an inner source of guidance and wisdom and compassion and love. And what I love is that people can think of that inner resource in so many different ways. So you don't have to hold any particular framework or set of beliefs to be able to make use of it. There are people who think of it as God. There are people who think of it as a spirit guide, as an angel, people who think of it as an aspect of their own higher self or wise mind. But what I have found is that really making that connection and developing a deep relationship with that source of wisdom and compassion is enormously helpful to people. And then from that place, there's so much more that we can do in terms of helping people really discern and engage with what their purpose is here on this earth, heal old wounds, childhood traumas, release limiting beliefs and imprints, and so many of the things that keep people locked in suffering and confusion and dysfunctional relationships. So the key to all of that, in my experience, is really starting with this connection to, we could also call it a larger self.
I know I was reading in your book that you actually work with people on the phone, all over the world.
Absolutely.
And how does that work to do it that way?
Well, lots of people like the visual contact and to be in somebody's presence, but because what I'm really doing is helping people connect more deeply with themselves and connect more deeply with an inner resource that they can access anytime, wherever they are, whoever they are, it doesn't really need to happen one-on-one with us across a table from each other like you and I are right now. It can happen on the phone, it can happen via Skype, it can even happen via the online courses that I'm developing now to help people make more use of the material in the book.
So you do have the choice of, if a person wants to see you or not, such as with Skype, you can do computer via computer or not, I guess.
Absolutely. I mean, it's amazing the technology that's available to us now. I do work with people by Skype, and with the online courses, I'll be offering some classes using Google Chat where I can have up to 10 people in the group who are able to see each other as well, no matter where they are in the world.
That's amazing.
It really is. Yeah. But so much of this work, as I said, is about helping people connect more deeply in with themselves, in with the earth, in with whatever they hold most sacred, whatever helps them feel most whole. And so that can happen just with my voice, just with the words. As I'm sure you know, you wouldn't be here and I wouldn't be here if we hadn't had our lives changed by books.
Ruth, could you please tell us about shamanic journeying that you have written about in your book?
Well, the practice of shamanic journeying that I teach was developed by an anthropologist named Michael Harner, who actually studied wisdom traditions, spiritual traditions, medicine traditions in a number of different parts of the world. And what he found was that even though they had many differences on the surface, there was a certain core body of wisdom and understanding that seemed to be there in all of the different cultures that he studied. And so out of that, he developed what he called core shamanism. And shamanism is basically just a word that we're using now to describe tools and practices that interface between this level of reality, the physical level, and the unseen level, which is what religion has always talked about. Spirituality has always grappled with the unseen level, the level of the soul, the spirit. And I think we as writers are also always working with unseen reality or non-physical reality when we're working with emotions and memories.
That's that your description made it easier for me to understand. Really. Can you give us a few tips for connecting with higher consciousness?
Sure, yeah, I actually have a whole list of them in the book.
Yeah, you have many.
Yeah.
So I thought maybe it would be nice to share, just to give us a little taste, and then people can refer to this.
Yeah. Well, and part of what I hope to do in the book is reach all different kinds of people who have all different kinds of belief systems. So, for instance, you mentioned that you live by the river and you love the river, and I live by the river and I love the river. And so whether or not you think of that as higher consciousness, my guess is that when you're sitting down by the river, something different happens to you that's, might feel a little different than when you're in Safeway waiting online. There's just a broader expanse. There's the connection with nature. There's the flowing of the water. There's the looking up at the leaves of the trees. At least this is what happens to me when I'm by the river. There's the little striped fish and the little frogs hopping between the stones. And all of that, to me, puts me in a much more peaceful, relaxed, expanded state of being. And I think both in my own experience and through the ages, people have found that connecting to that part of our own being, that more relaxed, expanded, peaceful part of ourselves, is what helps us have inner knowing. When we just feel what's right for us, we feel what's most important in our lives, versus when we're, sitting behind the wheel of the car in a traffic jam. If you're an enlightened master, you can contact higher consciousness then too. But for most people, it's easier in a natural setting that you love, or listening to music that you love, or perhaps looking at art that really moves you, perhaps being around people to whom you're very close but have a peaceful connection, because sometimes, of course, we have difficult connections with people that we're very close to.
So it's finding what works for you.
Absolutely.
So you can't just tell people, well, everybody must go to the river.
No,
Right.
Absolutely.
It's what will work for them as an individual.
Yeah, there are many people who seem to have a particular connection with the natural world. For many people, the natural world, whether it's the river or trees or being in their own garden, helps them get to that more peaceful, expanded place. But I have a client whose place where she goes to connect is a bowling alley. You know, that's in and she goes there in her mind to connect with her own sources of inner wisdom. Mm-hmm. She's a very urban person. She doesn't feel that connection to nature.
Mm-hmm. So it's also not just physically going there, but knowing what place helps you and then going there in your mind.
Absolutely. One of the things I talk about a lot in the book is the imagination. Mm-hmm. And in our culture, we've been taught to really discount the power of the imagination. You know, we say that something is all in your imagination as a way of saying it's not real or it's not important. But in fact, in my experience, what lives in our imagination, it's like what lives in our hearts, what lives in our memories, what lives in the non-physical aspect of our being is enormously impactful. And lots of studies have shown this as well, that if somebody sits for a few minutes and imagines themselves in an environment that brings them peace, let's say imagines themselves next to a flowing waterfall or in a beautiful meadow, somebody's heart rate will change, somebody's, brain pattern will change. Versus, if you said to somebody, here, sit here and imagine yourself in a horrible traffic jam. You would see those same changes, but in the opposite direction, right? Yeah. So the imagination is an incredibly powerful tool.
It is indeed. Tell us, what is soul retrieval?
Soul retrieval is something I love to talk about, so thank you for asking that question. In the shamanic framework, that is one of the frameworks I work with, there's an understanding that at times of trauma, a part of our soul splits off from the rest of us, and that helps us in that moment to bear the trauma. But as time goes on, it also leaves us less than whole, and it leaves that part of the soul stuck in whatever was going on at the time where it split off. And so a trauma could be a car accident, a trauma could be someone's death, a trauma could be just witnessing one's parents have a terrible fight, a trauma could be being abused. So many different kinds of things that can cause soul loss. What I love about the understanding of soul retrieval is that we can actually go back in, again, using the tool of the imagination, using our access to non-physical reality and to our inner wisdom, our guides, our sources of guidance. We can go back into those places where a part of us got disconnected, and we can find that part again, we can help it to heal, and we can bring it back into ourselves.
Do you find it helps for people to talk about the disconnection that has occurred in their life?
It can. I think it's all about context. And in psychology these days, a lot of attention has been given to looking at what kinds of talking help people move out of the trauma and what kinds of talking actually just keep them stuck or even re-traumatize them. You know, we've all probably experienced times where we talk kind of compulsively about something, and it's like we're trying to talk our way through it, but instead we just dig those grooves deeper. And brain research actually shows now that those are neural pathways sometimes that we're carving that we can get stuck in. So it's not simply talking about it, but it's talking about it with tools and with a direction so that we can talk about it, we can gain a larger perspective, we can see it and experience it differently now than we did then, and then we can actually bring that part of ourself back and move through it.
You have a chapter on how and why our choices really matter. Mm-hmm. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Sure, yeah. I wrote this book with the help of what I call my own guides or inner teachers, my own sources of guidance. And one of the things that I get from my guidance over and over is the idea that it's not what we do that matters so much, but why and how we're doing it. Sometimes people can take the exact same action on the outside, let's say recycling. Recycling our paper and our glass. That's clearly a good thing to do for the earth, right? But somebody can do that from a place of really loving the earth and loving humanity and loving all the incredible animal species that populate this earth. And they can lovingly rinse out their tin cans and their glass bottles and their plastics and put them in the recycling bin as an act of love and connection and care. Or somebody might be doing those same things from a feeling of anger or self-righteousness or bitterness or even hopelessness. And the energy that fuels our actions, whatever those actions are, has an enormous impact both on how we personally feel as we go throughout our day and how we affect other people.
That's very simply put, and a good example. No, thank you. You have a chapter on money and abundance.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about that chapter?
Sure, yeah. Well, that's money and love and sex are usually the things that get people's attention the most, right? Because so many of us feel like we don't have enough of those things, or we don't have as much of those things as we want. And so the approach that I take to helping people work with money and abundance is to really understand money as symbol and metaphor for receiving in this life and in this world. And the fascinating thing that I find in working with people who feel like they don't have as much money as they want, or they're stuck around money, is that very often there's a feeling within them of not deserving, not being fully connected to life, not trusting themselves to receive what they most need. Now, I also want to say we're working within a larger socioeconomic system, which is not a just system in this country and in this world. And so I don't mean at all to say that everyone who has enough money is psychologically and spiritually healthy, or that everyone who doesn't have enough money, that's somehow their fault. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I do believe that wherever we are on the economic spectrum, there are ways that we can work with ourselves, with our connection to life, with our connection to wisdom and trust, feeling deserving, feeling safe, that can really help us not only have more money, if that's what we need, or more love or more connection, if that's what we need, but really help us to be and do what we want to be and do on this earth. So money is one of the things that people are very aware of when we have an imbalance around money or an imbalance around love in our personal relationships. It makes us suffer. And suffering is painful, but one of the things that I have found is that suffering often is also what motivates us to grow. So I love to work with people who are struggling with money or struggling with love for those reasons.
And then there's another type of person I know you deal with, is a person who has to deal with physical pain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And how do you work with that issue?
Yeah, absolutely. Physical pain and physical illness are other big sources of suffering and big things that get our attention. With physical pain, it's very interesting because, understanding that the mind and the heart and the spirit and the body are all essentially one system. Sometimes the cause of physical pain really does originate in the body, but sometimes I have found with clients that physical pain that doctors have not been able to explain has resolved when we've done certain pieces of emotional work. I had one client who had this long-standing physical pain in her arm, and as we explored some of the images and feelings that came up when we were working with it, it came down to anger. And she had an extreme discomfort with her own anger, and also a big reservoir of anger in her body based on some of the things that she had experienced in her life. And as we were able to help her be more comfortable with the anger and let some of the energy of the anger flow through her body, the pain in her arm disappeared and never came back.
One of my favorite sections in the book was the part on prayers and intentions. I liked that you had blank spaces. So it really, is it okay for me to call it almost a workbook?
Absolutely, yeah.
I wasn't certain because you called it a guidebook. But when I saw that, to that someone could read your affirmations and prayers and fill in the blank. Maybe you can give an example of one of, a few of the affirmations.
Sure, absolutely. And I totally encourage people to use this as a workbook, because my belief is that whatever you make your own, wherever you fill in what is really relevant for you, meaningful for you, difficult for you, that will have much more power than anything that I can prescribe by rote, or any orthodoxy. And so I have a whole section of prayers in the back of the book, as you know, designed to help people do all kinds of things that we often find difficult. There's a prayer for times when we feel lonely. And a lot of what I do in that prayer is try to help people connect with all of the different sources of connection that are available to us in our lives constantly, every minute of every day. We're actually never disconnected, even though we can feel disconnected. And so when we're able to remind ourselves of all of those connections and kind of open the portals in our being to be able to feel the connection more, it actually also opens the doorways for us to connect more with friends or with partners, or those kinds of connection that we can be most focused on at times. There's also a prayer to help people let go of a relationship that they need to let go of, whether it's because someone has died or someone has left, to let go with forgiveness and with love and with blessing, which is also, of course, a way of bringing love and blessing into our own hearts when we can let go of somebody else in that way.
I had read that you have received so much positive feedback from this book. It's almost like you have testimonial after testimonial. Tell us one of the best positive feedbacks you got from somebody after reading your book.
I don't know which one is the best, but I did just have a client the other day who was...
that really meant something to you, that, oh, this book is working.
Yeah, well, I just had a client the other day who said that the prayers really, really work for her, that she uses the prayers and she feels changes in her life. And so that was really thrilling to me to hear.
Yeah. Well, you word it very simply so that somebody could take those and use their own words. And so you're not saying, you need to say these prayers, you need to say these affirmations. It's, oh, I think I'll say it this way. And then it works for an individual.
Yeah, and along those lines, I like to even say that the word prayer is a turnoff for some people. And the way I see prayer is really that we are setting our intention. We are kind of declaring within ourselves what we want help with, what direction we want to move in. And then we're just asking for help from the larger forces, however we understand them, whether we think of that as our own unconscious or whether we think of it as the spirit of life itself, or however we understand it. Because I think so many people have gotten turned off to prayer by being forced to prayer in very specific ways that they didn't connect to, perhaps, as children.
That they were too rote.
Exactly, exactly, where they couldn't really bring themselves on what was alive for them and meaningful for them.
A personal prayer.
Right, exactly.
Please help me connect better with my mother.
Exactly.
Instead of our Father who art in heaven, blah, 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 blah.
Right. And so I even encourage people, dispense with the word prayer if you don't connect with the word prayer.
That's why I see that you wrote the word intentions.
Yeah.
So you'll use both of those words.
Right. And they're a little bit different, but they work together, I think, because our intention is, let's say your intention, hypothetically in this example, is you want to connect better with your mother. The act of prayer, as I understand it, is asking for help from larger forces, however you understand what those forces might be. So it's not just you, Jeannie, struggling with your own longstanding patterns with your mother. You're also able to access help from larger forces. And so I use the example in the book of, setting an intention is like having a wheelbarrow to move heavy objects around. But using prayer is like getting a team of winged horses to kind of, fly with your heavy objects.
I like how you wrote that and present that. That really works in a personal way.
Oh, thank you.
I think it would be really helpful to the audience if you could read us a passage from your book.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I thought I would read a little bit from the introduction, just about how I came to write the book, essentially.
Yeah, that's very interesting for everybody.
When I was a small child, each night I said a silent thank you to everything I could see from my window. The lampposts and their shining lights, the trees with their solid bodies and moonlit shimmer of leaves, even the bicycles locked to their sturdy posts. In ways I couldn't speak of, I knew I was connected and held. Yet that connection and holding didn't stop my father from molesting me. It didn't prevent my sister from cutting her arms with razor blades, starving herself, or becoming an addict. It didn't keep my mother out of a second abusive marriage. Nor did it teach me how to heal their pain or my own. It only left me with a burning desire to understand. What were any of us doing here? Why did people hurt so much? And what, if anything, could I do about it? My search led me in directions I would never have anticipated. Although I had always thought of myself as a fairly left-brain person, my skepticism gave way to awe during what turned out to be a 4-year apprenticeship to a brilliant shamanic teacher and healer. As I became able to contact and trust my own sources of inner guidance, I learned how to heal damaging patterns that had plagued me all my life. I also developed an entirely new understanding of myself and my place in the universe. These changes made my life more purposeful and more free, more focused and more joyful than I could ever have imagined. And that's really why I wrote this book, because I went through my own journey. And, I'm glad to have read those paragraphs, because I think talking about some of the painful things that have happened in my own life makes it more real. And I work with people that have had astonishingly painful, difficult, traumatic things happen in their lives. And the truth is, whether we came from dysfunctional families or not, all of us have confronted incredible pain and difficulty in our lives. There's nobody who escapes it. And so that's why I feel so passionate about the material in this book, because it gives people tools that I looked for a long time before I found them. Tools that can really make a difference to that suffering.
Well, Ruth, it was a pleasure having you on WriterSpeak. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure talking with you.
I would like to thank the audience for watching WriterSpeak. And this show has been produced in Santa Rosa at the Community Media Center. And I would especially like to thank our sponsor, the Sonoma County Gazette. Please stay tuned for further episodes of WriterSpeak with personal chats with local authors.